My collarbone just snapped. I bite my tongue until I taste blood to keep from screaming. I'm just the invisible handmaiden. I'm supposed to hold my perfect sister's veil, but the most ruthless alpha on the continent just walked right past his bride. He is staring directly at me, and he smells the monster hiding under my skin. Chapter 1. The steel needle tore through the pad of Sloane's thumb. Copper flooded her mouth the instant she sucked the wound dry, swallowing the crimson drop before it could ruin the pristine white silk draped over her lap. Beneath her ribs, a violent, feral thing clawed at her breastbone, desperate to break free. Down, she willed the beast, tasting salt and iron. Stay down. Watch what you are doing, you clumsy idiot, Alara hissed. Crushed roses and expensive powder suffocated the air as her sister spun around. Ilara stood flawless, wrapped in pale chiffon, radiating the smug cruelty of a favored child. Sloane smelled of dirt, sweat, and caged violence. Tucking her chin toward her sternum, she folded her shoulders inward. Survival in this pastel nightmare meant shrinking until she vanished entirely into the floorboards. Sorry, Sloane mumbled. Her fingernails dug into the meat of her jaw, forcing her head up. The alpha of the Obsidian Peaks is landing right now, Alara whispered, the words coated in venom. He is looking for a mate. I will be chosen. You will stay in the shadows and keep your freakish nature to yourself. Do you understand? Yes, Sloane breathed. The floorboards vibrated against the soles of her shoes. A rhythmic, concussive thud battered the crystal chandeliers overhead, sending prisms of light scattering across the wallpaper. Sloane clutched her stomach. The dormant beast inside her mind snapped awake, ears twitching at the mechanical roar outside. A low rumble tore at her vocal cords, grating like sandpaper, but she swallowed the sound along with a mouthful of stagnant air. Show them the true size of the monster, and they would butcher her before nightfall. This pack worshipped delicate, fragile things. Sloane was a nightmare shoved violently into a human suit. The grand oak doors splintered open, cracking against the plaster walls. The scent hit her in a physical wave, obliterating the sickening rose perfume. Sharp pine, wet earth, and fresh blood flooded the grand hall. Instinct hijacked her limbs. Retreating into the darkest corner of the room, she pressed her spine against the cold velvet drapes. Was she terrified of the ruthless warlord storming into their territory? Or of the way her own predator whined, straining against its leash to get a taste of him? Bootsteps cracked like gunshots against the marble. Predatory, lethal. Sloane kept her vision, locked on the scuffed leather of his boots, forcing her lungs to inflate and deflate in measured counts. But the temperature in the room skyrocketed. Static electricity crawled over her skin, making the hairs on her arms stand rigid. The air in the hall turned to ash in her throat. Something vicious and undeniable was about to detonate.
The concussive blast of the helicopter blades faded into a low whine as Roman crossed the manicured lawn, absolute disgust curling his lip. This territory reeked of cheap floral perfume and trembling, spineless prey. Mud caked the soles of his combat boots, and he dragged them deliberately across the pristine marble entrance, grinding dirt into the polished stone. He needed a ruthless political asset, not a fragile bride. Knives waited in the dark corners of his own inner circle, traitors plotting to strip the crown from his bloody hands. Dozens of painted, shivering girls stood lined up across the grand hall. They dipped their heads, displaying their necks like pathetic, breakable dolls. Then, the draft shifted. Roman stopped dead. Beneath the suffocating stench of lilacs, a different scent clawed its way into his lungs. Raw thunder, and the sharp, bitter tang of a predator locked in a cage far too small for its bones. "Alpha, Roman," a cloying voice echoed. A petite blonde in a suffocatingly tight dress stepped from the line, offering a calculated, hollow smile. The favored daughter. Ilara. It is an honor to welcome you, she purred. Roman stared through the center of her skull. No scars, no grit. A king facing a war does not waste time playing with porcelain. With every pulse of blood through his veins, that dark ozone scent grew sharper. Dismissing the blonde completely, he shifted his focus. Past the bowing guards, past the crystal vases, his gaze slammed into the darkest corner of the room. A girl in a drab gray uniform stood pressed against the drapes. She hunched her shoulders, eyes glued to the floor tiles. But Roman read the tension wire-tight across her back. He watched the rigid, brutal line of her spine. She wasn't cowering. She was physically wrestling her own skeleton to keep from tearing the room apart. His own beast, notoriously cold and silent, slammed against his ribs. Dangerous, the predator growled in his mind. Good, Roman answered. I need dangerous. The girl's hands shook against her apron. It wasn't terror vibrating through her knuckles. It was pure, violent restraint. The empty space between them ignited, burning with a sudden, suffocating heat. He wanted to pry her ribs apart and see the exact shape of the nightmare she was hiding. Let them keep the pretty princess. He wanted the shadow standing right behind her.
The sheer force of his golden stare burned through the grey cotton of her uniform, anchoring her feet to the floorboards. Why was the most lethal alpha on the continent watching a nameless, freak handmaiden cower in the corner? "Bring the champagne, you fool," Ilara hissed, a sharp whisper cutting through the static in Sloane's ears. Blinking away the fog, Sloane wrapped her fingers around the rim of the enormous silver tray. 20 crystal flutes bubbled with pale liquid, carrying a combined weight that would snap a normal girl's wrists, but it felt like empty air in her grip. Keep her head down, serve the glass, survive the night. She navigated the narrow gap between the rival pack members. Without warning, a polished black boot shot out into her path. Her toe caught the leather heel. Gravity vanished. As she pitched forward, the silver tray slipped from her palms, sending the 20 crystal flutes plummeting toward the merciless marble floor. Ilara sucked in a sharp breath. The ambient chatter of the room flatlined. Shatter this glass, and her father would drag her by the hair into the silver-lined cell for a week. Instinct obliterated human thought. Brilliant, unnatural amber fire swallowed her vision. A brutal, guttural snarl ripped past her teeth, vibrating against the stone walls. Contorting her spine midair, she whipped her arm down faster than the eye could track. Her fingers clamped onto the falling metal edge. She caught the tray, a single inch above the stone. Not a single flute tipped, not one drop of alcohol splashed the rim. But she had gripped the tray with the full, unchained force of her beast. The solid silver screamed under the pressure, warping and buckling. Her knuckles ground deep indentations into the steel, permanently crushing the metal into the shape of her hands. The ringing in her ears deafened her. Dust motes drifted slowly through the shaft of light, cutting across the silent room. She tasted blood on the inside of her cheek. Slowly she straightened her spine, dragging oxygen into her burning lungs. Her glowing amber eyes drifted up, colliding violently with the predatory gold of Alpha Roman. The earth stopped turning. He didn't recoil. There was no disgust twisting his features, no horror at the ruined silver in her grip. Total starving fascination radiated from his frame. He saw the crumpled metal. He saw the lethal speed. He saw the monster. Shattering the quiet, Roman abandoned the golden daughter and stalked toward Sloane. Each strike of his boot against the stone pounded like a war drum. She wanted to bolt, to sprint into the tree line, but the gravity of his presence locked her joints in place. She clutched the ruined tray to her sternum like a pathetic shield. He stopped inches from her boots. The scent of pine and impending violence wrapped around her throat, choking out the oxygen. A scarred, calloused hand reached across the divide. His rough fingertips brushed against the warped silver, where her ungodly strength had crushed the rim. "You did not drop it," Roman said. The gravelly baritone vibrated straight through her breastbone, pulling a sharp ache from her chest. "No," Sloane managed to scrape out. "Good." Dark, obsessive fire ignited in his irises. Roman turned his head, locking eyes with the host alpha across the room. I don't want the blonde," Roman stated, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He pointed a scarred finger directly at the center of Sloane's chest. "I am taking the monster."
The silence stretched so thin it threatened to snap. Dust motes hung suspended in the shaft of light, cutting across the grand hall, disturbed only by the jagged, wet sound of Alara sobbing into her manicured hands. Host Alpha's face mottled a violent purple. Roman let the older man's outrage wash over him like a passing breeze. He kept his golden stare anchored on the Maid. She clutched the warped silver tray to her sternum, wielding the ruined metal like a Spartan shield. She was cornered. She was bleeding. But her spine remained perfectly, defiantly straight. Reaching inside his leather jacket, Roman extracted a folded legal document. He tossed the dense stack of parchment onto the marble tiles. The resounding slap cracked like a gunshot. Silence flooded the room again, rushing in to fill the space where the echo died against the vaulted ceiling. "I am not here for a mating run," Roman stated. The raw baritone of his voice vibrated against the crystal chandeliers. "I am here for an employee." Host Alpha lunged forward, fists curled into tight knots. "You insult my house. You reject my prime daughter for a lowly servant?" Roman didn't raise his voice. He didn't snarl. He simply let his elongated canines slip past his bottom lip. A quiet, lethal chill dropped the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Host Alpha stumbled backward, his boots scraping frantically against the stone, suffocated by the sheer, crushing weight of Roman's aura. Knives waited in the shadows of his own syndicate. Traitors were poisoning his ranks, and his juvenile enforcers were turning into feral, rabid animals, slaughtering their instructors in the subterranean rings. He needed a monster to break his monsters. Under the gravity of his stare, the Maid lowered the tray. Her amber eyes widened, calculating the sudden shift in power. "Her name is Sloane," the host Alpha spat, disgust dripping from the syllables. "She is clumsy. She is useless." A dark, rumbling laugh vibrated in Roman's chest. The empty air between him and the girl sparked with raw static. "Sloane will sign my contract tonight," Roman murmured softly. Turning his back on the furious crowd, he pointed a scarred finger toward the oak doors of the coat room. He didn't look back as he stalked toward the exit, his boots echoing rhythmically in the quiet. "Bring her to me when the ink dries."
Fingernails dug viciously into the sensitive flesh at the nape of Sloane's neck, dragging her backward down the corridor. Her father shoved her hard against the cedar paneling of the cramped coat room. The oak door slammed shut, severing them from the grand hall and plunging the tiny space into suffocating darkness. Mothballs and damp wool clogged her throat. She tasted copper where she had bitten the inside of her own cheek. Her father gripped the thick contract in his trembling fist, his features contorted into a feral snarl. Without warning, he struck her collarbone with a solid silver pen. "Sign the paper, you miserable freak," he growled. Air locked in her lungs. Refusing a warlord like Roman meant drawing a bloody target on her pack's back. Her father would gladly snap her neck before he let a turf war breach his territory. The scent of the silver pen stung her nose, dragging a violent flashback to the surface. She was 12 years old, screaming in the subterranean basement. He had shoved her into a silver-lined cage for losing control of her shift. 3 agonizing days of blistered skin, the stench of burning hair, and the metallic taste of tears were permanently branded into her brain. Staring at the stark, black ink on the parchment felt exactly like stepping back into that toxic cell. The document wasn't a marriage certificate. It was a binding, ironclad employment contract to enter the brutal training rings of the Obsidian Peaks Syndicate. Her knuckles trembled. The wolf inside her threw itself against her ribs, demanding to tear the throat out of the man, pinning her to the wall. Pressure compressed the tiny room. The sharp prick of her father's claws against her pulse forced her hand upward. She snatched the pen. Dragging a quick, jagged breath into her lungs, she dragged the silver tip across the dotted line. The second her signature finished, her suppressed rage spiked. The rigid casing of the pen snapped violently in half. Black ink exploded across her pale fingers, dripping hot and sticky onto the floorboards. She tossed the jagged plastic at his boots. He snatched the parchment away, backing hurriedly toward the door. 30 minutes later, Sloane hoisted a worn canvas duffel bag over her shoulder, stepping out of the front gates and straight toward the waiting black SUV. Tires crunched violently over the broken asphalt, bringing the armored SUV to a sudden jarring halt. For 3 agonizing hours, Sloane had kept her chin tucked to her chest, suffocating in the dark back seat next to Roman. His tall frame radiated a scorching, electrical heat that made her dormant wolf whine with conflicting desire. But she refused to look at him. The door lock clicked. Metal groaned as the driver yanked the passenger door open. Freezing wind slapped Sloane across the face the second her boots hit the dirt. The atmosphere here punched the oxygen straight out of her lungs. Exhaust fumes, stale sweat, and the sharp copper tang of fresh blood coated the back of her throat. This was the Obsidian Peaks compound, gritty, industrial, and dripping with raw violence. Roman's shadow eclipsed the moon, falling over her small frame. He didn't speak. He simply raised a leather-clad arm, pointing a scarred finger toward a sprawling dirt arena enclosed by a rust-covered chain-link fence. The training rings. Lowering his arm, he turned on his heel. He stalked away toward a towering glass skyscraper, his boots crunching over the gravel. He was abandoning her in the dirt. Silence rushed in to fill the void he left behind. Sloane tightened her trembling fingers around the nylon strap of her duffel bag. The night air bit into her exposed skin. A defensive rumble vibrated in her chest as she approached the rusted fencing. Moonlight painted long, distorted shadows across the blood-stained earth of the arena. Without warning, a blur of grey fur erupted from the darkness. The juvenile wolf collided headfirst with the chain-link barrier directly in front of her face. E-steel rattled violently against the concrete posts. The impact reverberated through the soles of her shoes. White foam dripped from the animal's snapping jaws. It clawed frantically at the wire, shredding its own paws in a desperate attempt to rip her throat out through the tiny metal diamonds. Yellow, bloodshot eyes spun wildly in their sockets, devoid of any human rationality. These were not normal shifter recruits. They were rabid, mindless killing machines. Sloane couldn't rip her gaze away from the carnage. She inhaled the rust. She tasted the dust kicking up from the beast's frantic pacing. Adrenaline flooded her veins, burning away the lingering fear from the car ride. She didn't retreat. She didn't scream. Instead, the monster buried deep inside her ribcage purred. The feral violence of the compound didn't terrify her beast. It woke it up. Dropping her duffel bag into the dirt, Sloane stepped 1 inch closer to the rattling fence, letting her own eyes flash a brilliant, predatory amber.
Condensation bled down the cold glass of the tower window. Roman gripped a ceramic mug of black coffee, the scalding heat grinding against his calluses. 30 stories below, the sprawling dirt arena looked like an open grave in the fading light. Metals shrieked against concrete. The rusted gate of the training pit swung inward, spitting Sloane into the center of the dust. She stood completely still. 10 juvenile shifters flanked her instantly. Gray fur bristled, and yellow eyes tracked her every twitch. They circled her small frame, snapping their jaws at the empty air, waiting for the human to break. Roman pressed a hard knuckle against his bottom lip. He needed her vicious. He needed the unchained monster he saw crack the silver tray. Yet, she tucked her chin. She folded her shoulders inward, or hiding her lethal strength beneath the posture of a battered servant. Just beyond the chain-link fence, a different problem materialized. Silas, a pureblood lieutenant, leaned against the rusted mesh. The man smiled, tapping a crimson folder against his thigh. Those pages contained the exact coordinates of Roman's upcoming moonshift. Dirt exploded in the pit. The largest juvenile lowered its head, claws gouging deep trenches into the earth. Wild, unfiltered madness burned in its irises. Would she finally fight? The ceramic handle cracked in Roman's grip. He stepped closer to the window, the glass freezing against his forehead. Without a sound, the gray beast launched itself directly at her throat.
Wind ripped across her face as the grey blur blotted out the arena lights. Wet teeth snapped a fraction of an inch from her left ear. Instinct hijacked her skeleton. Sloane dropped to the dirt, sliding beneath the lethal arc of the predator's jaws. Releasing her own beast meant a public execution, so she forced the monster down, locking her joints tight. Instead of shifting, she reached up. Her fingers locked around the creature's thick foreleg. Planting her boots firmly into the dust, she used its own ferocious momentum as a weapon. She pivoted her hips, dragging the arm down and throwing the beast over her shoulders in one fluid, brutal arc. Bone cracked against hard earth. A cloud of brown dirt plumed into the freezing air. The snarls of the other juveniles died in their throats. Only the wet, rasping sound of the fallen wolf struggling to draw breath broke the quiet. Then the physical backlash hit. Suppressing her dominant wolf while using its raw strength tore through her anatomy. Fire shredded the soft tissue of her chest. It felt like swallowing broken glass. Stumbling backward, she abandoned the stunned pack. She dragged her boots across the dirt, pushing blindly through the rusted, swinging doors of the subterranean locker room. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Sloane crashed over a porcelain sink, gripping the cracked edges until her knuckles turned white. A violent cough racked her ribs, leaving dark blood coating the ceramic bowl. A shadow detached itself from the row of metal lockers behind her. Cloying cologne hijacked the damp air, completely masking the metallic tang of her own blood. Wiping a red smear from her chin, Sloane forced her eyes upward. The cracked mirror above the sink reflected a perfectly tailored suit. Silas stood 3 feet behind her, his polished shoes starkly out of place against the grimy tiles. "You fight like a filthy street rat," Silas murmured. Dead eyes dragged over her ruined uniform. Roman's stupid little pet. Panic spiked, sharp and cold in her stomach. Silas possessed the exact same vacant stare as the purebloods who ran the punishment cells back home. Calculate. Survive. She immediately curved her spine forward, dropping her chin to her chest. Striking a lieutenant guaranteed a death sentence. So she offered him the fragile, broken maid he expected to see. Silas's lips curled into a victorious sneer. He stepped closer, closing the distance until the heat of his chest pressed against her back. He trapped her against the wet porcelain. "His protection won't last, little maid," Silas whispered into her ear. Water dripped steadily from the rusted faucet. She locked her elbows against the sink, muscles trembling, bracing for a brutal strike to her spine. The steel door ripped off its hinges. Screaming metal echoed against the tiles. The temperature in the room plummeted to absolute zero, and the suffocating scent of sharp pine violently obliterated the cologne.
Screeching steel echoed against the wet tiles as the locker room door ripped free from its hinges. Roman eclipsed the entrance, his broad frame blocking the flickering fluorescent light. Golden fire burned in his irises, plunging the room's temperature to absolute zero. The smug cruelty drained from Silas's face. Shrinking away from the porcelain sink, the pureblood lieutenant melted into the shadows of the lockers. "Alpha," Silas whispered, his voice cracking. "Leave." The single syllable ground against the concrete floor, vibrating up through the soles of their boots. Silas scrambled through the ruined doorway. The heavy silence rushed back in, broken only by the frantic echo of his footsteps, fading down the corridor and the steady drip, drip of the rusted faucet. Sloane remained pressed against the wet sink. She projected the image of a fragile, broken maid, but Roman knew the illusion was a total lie. Reaching across the damp space, Roman locked his calloused fingers around her slender wrist. Her skin seared his palm like dry ice. He hauled her forward, dragging her out of the subterranean compound and straight into the freezing night. Boot steps crunched rhythmically over the dry gravel. Silver moonlight bleached the sprawling dirt arena as Roman finally spun on his heel, dropping her arm in the center of the ring. "Why did you bow down to that rat?" Roman demanded. "You are not a maid anymore." Dropping her chin, Sloane kept her gaze glued to the dust. "It is safer to be small." A violent memory flashed behind Roman's eyes. He was 10 years old, cowering under a wooden dining table to escape his uncle's wrath. The table had splintered, and the beating happened anyway. Hiding never works because the monsters always check the dark corners. "Look at me," he ordered. She didn't move. Rolling his shoulder, Roman drove his fist forward in a brutal, blinding arc aimed straight for her cheekbone. He didn't want to break her jaw. He wanted to wake up the predator sleeping inside her ribs. Her head snapped up. An arm shot out faster than humanly possible. Bone slammed against bone. She caught his driving fist in her pale hand. A concussive shockwave traveled straight down Roman's arm, rattling his elbow and shoulder joint. The harsh wind whistled past his trapped knuckles. Dust motes drifted lazily through the silver moonlight. Brilliant amber fire ignited in her eyes. A deep, guttural purr vibrated from her throat, cutting through the quiet. The icy air between them turned to static. Roman stepped forward, pressing his broad chest against her soft curves. His pulse hammered against his ribs. The scent of ozone and sweet rain hijacked his lungs. He wanted to crush his mouth against hers and swallow her wild fury whole. "There is the monster I hired," he whispered, leaning his jaw inches from her lips. A shrieking, mechanical siren sliced through the night, ripping the quiet to shreds.
Red strobe lights slashed across the cracked asphalt, painting the courtyard in jagged streaks of blood. The blaring alarm sucked the oxygen from the cold air as Sloane sprinted toward the holding pens, her boots slamming a frantic rhythm against the concrete. She skidded to a halt outside the heavy steel cages. Absolute chaos ruled the yard. A grey juvenile wolf battered its skull repeatedly against the iron bars, white foam spraying from its snapping jaws. 4 compound guards formed a tight perimeter around the pen, the metallic clack-clack of silver-loaded shotguns racking echoed under the siren. They aimed directly at the rabid teenager's chest. "Stand down!" Roman's baritone roared from the darkness behind her. The guards didn't flinch. Up on the rusted catwalk, Silas stood completely still. The pure-blood lieutenant gave a single, quite cold nod. They were going to butcher the boy. The metallic smell of impending death coated the back of Sloane's throat. She didn't negotiate. She didn't search for a key. Planting her boots, Sloane launched herself into the air. She bypassed the mental locks, forcing a violent, unnatural partial shift mid-flight. Her joints popped with sickening wet cracks. Cartilage stretched. Human skin tore as dark, roped muscle violently reformed underneath. Obsidian claws erupted from her fingernails, gleaming in the red light. She crashed onto the concrete between the silver barrels and the rabid beast. A demonic, earth-shattering roar tore out of her mutated throat. The primal sound wave hit the concrete walls, shattering the glass bulbs overhead. Sparks rained down into the dirt. The clattering ring of dropped shotguns echoed through the yard as the guards stumbled backward in pure terror. Whimpering, the rabid juvenile dropped its belly flat against the dust, submitting instantly to an apex predator. Sloane stood to her full height. Sweat stung her eyes. Her deformed chest heaved, dragging gun oil and copper into her lungs. She had saved the boy, but her darkest secret was fully exposed under the emergency lights. Turning her head, she found Roman staring at her mutated, monstrous arms. He didn't look disgusted. Total starving pride radiated from his stance, but up in the shadows of the catwalk, Silas smiled. The lieutenant pressed a silver phone to his ear, his dead eyes locked entirely on Sloane.
Sunlight pierced the tinted windows of the penthouse boardroom, but the morning air remained suffocating. Stale espresso, expensive cologne, and the sour stench of pure-blood terror saturated the long mahogany table. 10 elders sat rigid in their leather chairs. Standing at the head of the room, Roman ground his molars together until the roots ached. His inner beast paced violently against his sternum. "She is a genetic abomination," Silas shouted, slamming a fist against the wood. "Her partial shift proves she is completely unstable. She must be executed today." Roman stared through the lieutenant. Sparing a hunting dog because it looks strange is survival. Executing it out of fear is how a farmer gets eaten by wolves in the winter. "Sloane saved my enforcer," Roman stated. His voice cracked like ice on a frozen lake. "Now she is a monster." An elder near the back spat. Leaning forward, Roman placed both hands flat on the table. "I am a monster, and I am your alpha." His fingers curled around a crystal water pitcher. Applying absolute pressure, Roman crushed the thick glass into powder. Shards sliced deep into his palm. Crimson droplets hit the polished wood, ticking rhythmically in the sudden, dead quiet. He didn't blink. A king writes his own laws in blood. "Sloane is under my absolute protection," Roman growled. "Touch a single hair on her head, and I will rip your throats out with my own teeth." The elders dipped their chins in weak submission. Rotting, bitter lies flooded Roman's senses. They were agreeing, but the scent of treason hung thick in the room. Shielding the woman he was obsessed with had just painted a lethal target on his spine. Hours later, the steel deadbolt of Roman's private vault clicked shut. Filtered ozone and total isolation filled the windowless room. Tracing a scarred finger over the paper calendar tacked to the wall, he stared at the red ink. The full moon was 48 hours away. During the shift, his skeleton would undergo bone lock. 10 agonizing minutes of total, crippling paralysis where he could not lift a single finger to defend himself. Silas knew. The purebloods were going to use that exact window to butcher him and steal the throne. Survival meant dragging the woman he was obsessed with directly into the bloody crossfire.
Rough calluses dragged slowly over the jagged tear on her forearm. The penthouse sat entirely silent, sealed off from the chaos of the compound below. The scent of iodine cut through the intoxicating, sharp pine radiating from Roman's skin as he worked. "You should not have jumped in front of those barrels," Roman murmured. He didn't look up from the bleeding laceration. "I had to." Sloane forced her vocal cords to work. Nobody else was going to save that kid. He didn't argue. Pressing a gauze pad over her torn flesh, He wrapped the white bandage with deliberate, exact care. The gentleness of it jarred her bones. Every time she had scraped a knee as a child, her mother would slap bandages onto the skin hard enough to leave bruises, complaining about the blood staining the floorboards. Our Roman touched her as if her bones were made of spun glass. Moonlight bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long silver shadows across the room. She finally dragged her gaze up to his face. "Silas has a rat," Roman stated. The baritone vibration of his voice hummed against the floorboards. "Someone gave him the security codes to open that cage today." The quiet fractured. A traitor was feeding the lieutenants from inside the inner circle. The realization coated her tongue in ash. They were entirely boxed in. Reaching inside the breast pocket of his jacket, Roman extracted a solid black keycard. A single silver emblem was etched into the plastic. "Take this." Her pulse skipped a beat. "What is it?" "It opens the subterranean vault." Roman pressed the rigid card flat against her palm. "Only I carry this access." His thumb dragged slowly across her knuckles before pulling away. He was handing her the keys to his deepest, most impenetrable sanctuary. The plastic bit into her skin as her fingers curled into a tight fist around the card. She craved the weight of his trust just as fiercely as she needed his protection. Roman leaned forward. The space between them vanished. Inhaling slowly against the crook of her neck, he dragged the scent of her adrenaline deep into his lungs. "You are my enforcer now," he growled. "You answer only to me." His lips brushed against the frantic beating pulse at her throat. The heat of it burned through her veins. She surrendered to the brand right then, perfectly aware that pledging loyalty to this warlord was dragging her straight into a war.
Dirt kicked into the air, blinding him for a fraction of a second. Roman ducked under the brutal arc of her leg, the heel of her boot whistling inches from his ear. The training arena sat abandoned under the moonlight, the quiet broken only by the sharp, ragged drags of their breathing. Sparring in the dirt had violently blurred the line between combat and foreplay. He had never encountered a woman who didn't shatter under his primal strength. Sloane lunged. Amber fire flared in her irises. Muscle and tendon coiled tight beneath her skin, fully committed to the strike. She was no longer holding back. She trusted him to take the hit. "Too slow," Roman barked. He caught her driving fist against his forearm. Hooking an arm around her waist, he used her own momentum to spin her backward. Spine met steel. She slammed into the rusted chain-link fence, the metal rattling violently under the impact. He stepped in, trapping her body against the wire. His broad chest pressed flush against her curves. The mint and copper tang of her breath fanned across his jawline. Adrenaline and raw electricity arced between them. Roman stared down at the flush creeping up her neck, fighting the urge to rip the fabric from her shoulders and bury himself in her heat right there in the dust. "You are holding the beast back again," he whispered, his voice thick with gravel. "I don't want to break you," she panted, her chest heaving against his sternum. A dark, wicked laugh rumbled in his throat. "You can't." Then his spine snapped. An explosive, agonizing detonation of pain ripped through his lumbar vertebrae. Roman's legs buckled completely. He crashed backward into the dirt. Bone cracked loudly against bone. Total shock paralyzed his vocal cords. The lunar cycle wasn't due for another 24 hours. Why was the shift triggering now? A second wave of agony crushed his rib cage. When he was 16, a rogue had dropped a granite boulder squarely onto his lower back, leaving permanent, jagged nerve damage woven through his marrow. The old trauma hijacked his biology, triggering the skeletal lock prematurely. He collapsed onto his side in the dirt. His joints fused into solid concrete. He couldn't lift a finger. He couldn't drag oxygen into his lungs. "Roman?" Sloane screamed. A mechanical shriek cut through the night air. The towering steel gates of the compound slammed shut, the electronic deadbolts firing into place with a sickening thud, locking them inside the pit.
Knees hitting the dirt, Sloane scrambled across the dust to reach him. Roman's muscular frame lay completely rigid in the dirt. Golden eyes stared blankly at the night sky, wide with trapped agony. Cold sweat beaded rapidly across his forehead and scarred cheeks. "What is happening?" Her voice cracked. She grabbed his jaw, the skin like ice beneath her palms. "Roman, look at me!" His teeth remained locked together. A single ragged whimper scraped its way up his throat. The terrifying reality crashed down on her. He was trapped in bone lock. The most lethal warlord on the eastern seaboard was currently paralyzed, entirely defenseless against a stiff breeze. "We have to get inside." Sliding her arms under his armpits, she braced her boots in the dirt. A guttural grunt tore from her throat as she called on the beast. She dragged his dead weight upward, hoisting his broad shoulders against her chest. His boots carved twin trenches through the dirt as she hauled him across the yard. Acid burned through her biceps by the time they reached the glass doors of the skyscraper. Fumbling with blood-stained fingers, she yanked the black keycard from her pocket and slapped it against the scanner. The elevator doors parted with a quiet chime. Minutes later, she dragged him over the threshold of the subterranean vault. Solid steel walls sealed them off from the world above. Lowering him gently onto the concrete floor, she stripped off her jacket and shoved it beneath his head. His breathing remained horrifyingly shallow. Watching the man who had shielded her from the syndicate lie helpless on the floor cracked something fundamental inside her chest. Her knuckles shook. Dust clung to her eyelashes. Kneeling beside him, she brushed the sweat-dampened hair from his forehead. "I am right here," she whispered to the quiet room. "I will protect you." Her left ear twitched. She froze. A soft, rhythmic scraping echoed through the concrete walls. Footsteps. 3 distinct pairs of boots echoing down the subterranean corridor. Silas's hit squad. The rat had fed them the schedule change. They knew Roman was paralyzed and trapped in the basement. Sloane stood up. The beast slammed itself against the cage of her ribs, demanding blood. She didn't push it down this time. The heavy steel wheel of the vault door began to turn slowly from the outside.
Concrete dust rained from the ceiling. A shock wave ripped through the floorboards, throwing Roman against the freezing cement. Above them, the steel handle on the vault door seized. An electronic screech pierced the dark. Deadbolts slammed into place. One after another, the locks engaged, sealing the underground cage. Agony lashed down his spine. He tried to push himself up, but his arms refused to respond. His legs were dead weight. Even turning his skull felt impossible. The cold floor seeped into his bones. Fluorescent light cut through the gloom. The security monitor above them flickered, buzzing with white static before resolving into a crisp image. Silas smirked through the glass. Behind the pureblood leader, smoke billowed from the ruins of Roman's upstairs office. Between his thumb and forefinger, Silas held a crushed blue vial, the poison. That explained the premature bone lock freezing Roman's nervous system. "Good evening, Alpha." Silas's voice crackled through the tinny speakers. "Your communication grid is gone. My men control the compound." The static hummed. Roman tasted rust on his tongue. He strained against the paralysis, golden eyes fixed on the screen. If he could move, he would tear Silas's throat out. But the venom held him captive. A coward's trick. He would have gnawed through his own wrist to reach Sloane, to shove her behind him, but his muscles remained locked in rigid agony. Silas leaned closer to the lens. "I am locking the vault down for 10 more minutes. Just enough time for my assassins to set the explosives outside your door." Boot steps scraped against the floor. Sloane stepped over him, placing her body between his paralyzed frame and the screen. She stood tall, refusing to flinch. On the monitor, Silas tapped a black tablet. The new video feed flickered over the glass, bringing the true nightmare straight to Sloane's front door.
The harsh blue light from the monitor cast long shadows across the underground cage. Sloane stared at the secondary screen in Silas's hand, the cold air stinging her lungs. The pixelated video feed shifted, revealing the pastel walls of her childhood home miles away. Elara slept in her bed. Beside her sister, a cloaked figure stood motionless. The assassin gripped a silver blade, resting the metal right against Elara's pulse point. Bile rose in Sloane's throat. She grabbed the edge of a steel table to stay upright. "You have a choice, little maid," Silas said. "There is an override code. It opens a back tunnel out of that vault." The monitor crackled. Dust drifted through the stark light. Sloane dug her nails into the metal, forcing air into her screaming lungs before the next blow landed. "Use the tunnel right now. Leave the compound forever, and I let your sister live." Silas dragged a finger across his own throat. "Stay to protect that paralyzed freak, and my man cuts Elara's neck. Then I broadcast your wolf form to every pack in the country. They will hunt you down." The screen went black. Total darkness slammed into the room. Only the emergency lights glowed red along the floor. Sloane looked down. Roman lay rigid on the concrete. He couldn't move. He couldn't fight. Elara had never protected her. Her sister was cruel, selfish, and bitter. But she was still blood. Sloane tasted copper. The silence in the vault rang in her ears. Stay and watch Roman die, or run and let her bloodline end in a slaughter. She backed away from Roman. Her boots scraped the cement, retreating into the shadows. The red emergency lights bathed the bunker in a bloody hue. Minutes bled away as Sloane crossed the vault, her boots dragging across the floor. She reached the supply corner and grabbed the canvas strap of her bag. She approached the keypad on the back wall. Her fingers punched in the code. A steel panel hissed back. Damp, stale air poured from the escape tunnel. Before stepping into the dark, she turned. Roman watched her from the floor. He didn't glare. His golden eyes lacked any trace of fury. Instead, he stared at the open tunnel, then back to her, begging her to go, ordering her to survive. The locking mechanism clicked, echoing off the walls. A frantic heat sparked in her chest. For years she had shrunk herself to survive the pureblood society. She had acted like prey, caught in a snare, waiting for the killing blow. But she wasn't prey. She let go of the canvas strap. The bag hit the cement with a dull thud. Leaving the tunnel open, she walked back to the center of the room. She dropped to her knees beside Roman and pressed her forehead against his sweating skin. "I am not leaving you," she said. The drill bit whined against the outside of the main vault door. Sparks showered through the crack in the steel. Sloane stood up. She faced the reinforced metal. A low rumble rattled in her chest, vibrating up her throat until it cracked into a guttural roar. Her bones began to snap, reshaping in the shadows as the door gave way. The whine of the industrial drill vibrated straight through the concrete floor and into her boots. A jagged line of orange sparks erupted from the vault frame. The bitter stench of scorched steel overpowered the damp chill of the bunker. Sloane tracked the glowing metal shards, bouncing across the room, her fingers twitching near the open escape tunnel. A rush of stale air pushed out of the dark passage behind her. She caught a feral scent under the ozone. Wet dirt, cheap lye soap, and the sour sweat of terrified kids. 3 juvenile wolves scrambled out of the ventilation shaft. The feral runaways from the training pits hit the cement, their coats matted with soot. The largest wolf instantly reformed into a gangly teenage boy, He clutched a silver-tipped spear, his knuckles bone-white. "We heard the blast," the kid rasped. He planted his bare feet wide. "We came to fight." Dust drifted down from the rattling ceiling. Sloane stared at the skinny kid armed with a stick, fighting a harsh burn in her throat. She wasn't standing over a paralyzed mate alone anymore. She pointed to the weapon rack. "Grab the iron pry bars." Survival instinct took over. They dragged steel workbenches across the floor, metal screeching against stone, stacking them into a crude barricade in front of the failing door. Then the screaming drills outside abruptly cut off. The suffocating quiet rang louder than the explosion, leaving nothing but the sound of her own racing pulse as she waited for the breach.
The grinding noise from the barricade scraped against Roman's eardrums as he lay pinned to the freezing floor. He tracked the movement through the corner of his eye, watching the teenagers stack steel tables over the vault entrance. Sloane stood at the center of the chaos. She refused to cower. Ignoring the escape tunnel, she barked tactical orders to the runaways, turning a tomb into a war room. Pride burned hot in his chest, fighting the cold numbness of the venom. Silas wanted him awake for this. The pure-blood coward used a sub-lethal dose, intending for Roman to watch his empire burn. But Silas miscalculated the dosage for an alpha. An electric sting fired down Roman's right arm. He focused all his scattered rage onto his fingers. Sweat pooled at his collarbone. He forced his mind past the agonizing wall of nerve pain, demanding his body obey. Behind the barricade, Sloane shoved a loaded shotgun into the teenage boy's chest. "Aim low," she ordered. "Do not let them cross the threshold." Roman's index finger twitched against the concrete, the smallest friction of skin against stone. Before he could pull his wrist inward, the reinforced hinges on the vault door let out a metallic shriek. A concussive blast rattled his teeth, blowing the thick steel completely inward.
The shockwave punched all the air from her lungs. A solid slab of iron sailed over their heads and slammed into the back wall, raining plaster down on the barricade. Acrid smoke poured through the blasted doorway. Sloane crouched behind the steel tables, swallowing the taste of sulfur. Her ears fed back a high, continuous whine. She waited for the dust to settle, tracking the black boots stepping through the rubble. 3 pure-blood assassins cleared the threshold, gripping silver broadswords. Silas strolled in right behind them. He smoothed the lapels of his tailored suit, looking entirely unbothered by the destroyed vault. "How touching," Silas drawled. He pointed his polished blade at the barricade. "The feral maid found some street rats to play hero with." Sloane stood up from behind the table. Instead of flinching, first she met Silas's gaze, letting the boiling energy in her gut rise to the surface. "This is your only warning," Sloane said. The glass bulbs overhead flickered, buzzing against the unnatural bass in her voice. "Back away from my alpha." Silas chuckled. The sound echoed off the ruined walls. "Gut the kids. Bring the freak to me." Sloane didn't reach for a weapon. She let the cage door in her mind snap open. The first bone break sounded like a gunshot. Her spine violently realigned, tearing her shirt down the center. Silas stopped laughing. The assassins froze. Coarse fur ripped through her pale skin, spreading over her expanding muscles. Her jaw unhinged, extruding razor-sharp fangs over a dripping maw. She let out a ground-shaking roar that blasted the smoke right out of the doorway, showing the purebloods exactly what kind of monster they had trapped. The silver broadsword swung down, striking solid bone beneath her fur. Metal shrieked. The blade snapped, sending jagged shrapnel pinging off the concrete walls. Before the pureblood could recover his footing, Sloane dragged her claws through the smoke, shredding the Kevlar plating over his chest. He hit the far wall and crumbled. Seeing his elite guard drop, the second mercenary abandoned his weapon. The steel blade clattered against the floorboards. Instinct drove her forward, pinning the screaming man to the cement. A guttural snarl vibrated against her ribs. Across the ruined bunker, Silas scrambled backward toward the shattered doorway. The tailored suit tore at the knees as he hit the ground. He dragged himself over the rubble, desperate to escape the carnage. Her hind legs coiled, launching her over the steel barricade. She landed directly in Silas's path, cracking the floor tiles under her paws. "Please," Silas choked out, holding up a trembling hand. "I will give you anything." The smell of his terror mixed with the sulfur in the air. For years, purebloods, like him, had shoved her into cages and demanded she shrink. No more. Her jaws snapped shut around his collar. Ripping him from the ground, she hurled the pureblood leader straight through the blasted doorway. He collided with the hallway wall. The sickening thud of bone on stone echoed through the corridor. Dust drifted over his motionless body. The ringing in her ears faded into a deafening quiet. Slowly, she pivoted her blood-slicked muzzle back toward the center of the vault, waiting for the true alpha to execute the monster she had become.
The synthetic venom finally burned out of his bloodstream. A harsh snap echoed through the silent vault as Roman forced his spine to unlock. Pain radiated through his nerve endings, but the primal need to protect his mate drowned out the chemical burn. His skin split. Bones lengthened and fused in a fraction of a second, shifting him into a battle-scarred wolf. He let out a territorial roar that rattled the loose ceiling fixtures. Pacing into the center of the demolished room, he scanned the wreckage. The mercenaries were dealt with. The runaway kids crouched safely behind the barricade. Then he found Sloane. She backed away from him, retreating into the darkest corner of the bunker. Enemy blood coated her obsidian fur. Her frame shook violently, head lowered to the dirty concrete in complete submission. She was waiting for the executioner. He tasted sulfur on the back of his tongue. He waited for the aggressive spike of his own adrenaline to level out before taking a single step toward her. He didn't bare his teeth. He didn't issue an alpha command. He crossed the ruined floor and stopped inches from her trembling claws. Lowering his scarred muzzle, Roman pressed his wet nose against her matted cheek. He bowed his neck, offering his throat to the most lethal predator in the room. He didn't just accept her survival instincts, he submitted to them. A broken whimper rattled in her chest. The coarse fur melted away, reforming into soft skin. She collapsed forward into his arms, entirely spent, clinging to the leather of his jacket as the dust settled around them.
6 weeks later, the morning sun baked the dirt of the compound's outdoor training ring. The sharp scent of pine needles mixed with the sweat of 50 enforcers doing strict push-ups in the dust. Sloane paced the center of the arena, her combat boots kicking up dry earth. She wore a fitted black tank top, shoulders pulled back, claiming every inch of space around her. "Drop lower," she ordered. Her voice carried across the compound without a microphone. The recruits instantly lowered their chests to the dirt, pushing through the muscle fatigue. They didn't see a fragile Maid anymore. They saw a syndicate general who had clawed her way out of the dark. She had built her own resilience, and now she was building theirs. A prickle of heat crawled up the back of her neck. She turned toward the perimeter. A Roman leaned against the chain-link fence, arms crossed over his leather jacket. His golden eyes tracked her every movement. Pushing off the metal mesh, he stalked past the panting recruits. The enforcers scrambled out of his path, making way for the alpha. The air between them practically hummed. "You are running my guard into the ground," Roman murmured, wrapping a calloused hand around her waist and pulling her against his chest. "They need to be ready for the street," she replied, her breath catching as his thumb traced the edge of her jaw. For so long, she had equated survival with silence, believing her self-worth was tied to how small she could make herself. But true power was standing in the brutal daylight, holding the line alongside someone who worshipped the darkest parts of her soul. They are ready, Roman said, dipping his head to capture her mouth. She kissed him back, with teeth and hunger. The rough leather of his jacket scraped against her knuckles. And as his grip tightened, a low, territorial rumble vibrated in her throat, a violent promise to anyone who dared test the borders of her new empire. When Silas gave Sloane the tunnel override code, she had to make an impossible choice: save her sister's life or stay beside a completely paralyzed Roman. Why do you think she ultimately chose to face the purebloods? Let's debate her decision down below.